I now give the floor to Madame Michèle Coninsx.
Merci à vous.
Thank you, sir.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the 10th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL and the range of United Nations efforts in support Member States in countering the threat. I would also like to thank Under-Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov for his overview of the report, and I commend and especially both UNOCT and the Analytical and Sanctions Monitoring Team led by Mr. Edmund Fitton-Brown for their collaboration in preparing this report together with others and with CTED. I also welcome the opportunity to hear Ms. Mona Frey share her experiences as a survivor of ISIL rule and her efforts to heal her community, building resilience against future radicalization to violence. I commend Mrs. Frey for her bravery and willingness to share her experiences with us today. It's vital that we listen to the voices of those directly affected by ISIL's atrocities and recognize the essential role played by women in building peaceful and resilient communities and preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Despite its military defeat in the Syrian Arab Republic and the death of its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIL continues to adapt and evolve. We will continue to face significant challenges in countering its activities. The magnitude of the problem is well documented, and the solutions are not easy, but inaction is not an option. And thousands of ISIL-associated women and children remain in makeshift camps in appalling conditions, leaving them to fight for survival, facing threats of further radicalization would not only be contrary to our shared principles of humanity, but also detrimental to our counter-terrorism efforts. To help Member States better understand the associated challenges and trends, CTED published 2 analytical briefs in September last year on the repatriation of ISIL-associated women and children. They highlight current approaches and challenges while emphasizing the urgent nature of the issue. Understanding the motivations and drivers of radicalization among ISIL associates, including women, is complex and multifaceted. We should avoid stereotyping, generalizing, and oversimplification in developing appropriate policy responses, particularly as women often had simultaneous roles as victims and perpetrators. They therefore require gender-responsive, tailored prosecution and rehabilitation strategies that are consistent with international human rights standards. And yet, the rate of return of ISIL-associated women remains significantly lower than that of men and children. Children, regardless of their affiliation, are primarily victims and must be dealt with as such. Being the most vulnerable, they have experienced tremendous trauma and suffering under ISIL. The internment of a generation of children is neither acceptable nor sustainable. Through repatriation and rehabilitation efforts, the international community must work together to prevent recurring cycles of violence and further victimization and offer these children a life of dignity and safety. I welcome the steps taken by some member states to repatriate all or some of their nationals from this group. Other impacted states should also seek to develop and implement comprehensive repatriation strategies that are in line with international law, including the principle of non-refoulement. The longer we wait, the less likely we are to succeed, and the ways in which we address prosecution, repatriation and rehabilitation efforts now will resonate for generations to come. Bringing ISIL perpetrators to justice continues to be of critical importance. CTED has been working closely with member states and UN agencies to facilitate support for this effort. We continue to help states identify gaps and facilitate delivery of technical assistance to strengthen national counterterrorism and countering violent extremism responses. In our recent assessment visits in Africa, we have noted the lack of mechanisms to address radicalization within correctional facilities, ineffective training of officials to manage violent extremist detainees, and the absence of rehabilitation and reintegration programs for prisoners upon release. Last November's Area Formula meeting discussed these issues and highlighted the varying degrees of success among member states' strategies to prevent radicalization in prisons and develop effective rehabilitation processes. Terrorists continue to be adept at using the internet to spread their propaganda and ideologies. This was the focus of discussion in last week's CTC Open meeting, which emphasized the need for a whole-of-society approach in countering terrorist narratives. During our assessment visits and dialogue with member states on behalf of the CTC, we have also seen the prosecution-related challenges associated with lack of admissible evidence, failure to guarantee due process and fair trial, the determination of criminal responsibility and jurisdiction. All of these challenges undermine states' effort to bring ISIL associates to justice through prosecution. To mitigate one aspect of this problem, in December last year, CTED issued the Military Evidence Guidelines aimed at strengthening the collection, handling, preservation and use of evidence collected by the military to prosecute terrorism-related offences. Taken together with CTED's joint initiative with UNODC on electronic evidence, these guidelines will help facilitate evidence collection and preservation for use in criminal and terrorist prosecution in compliance with international law. In this regard, I commend UNITAD's efforts to collect and preserve witness testimony, including its recent support for prosecutions in Finland to prosecute ISIL members for crimes committed in Iraq. ISIL depravity is evident from their numerous crimes, but its institutionalization of sexual violence and slavery requires special attention. I'm deeply troubled by the continued lack of progress in bringing to justice ISIL perpetrators of sexual violence. Women and children abducted by ISIL are not yet reunited with their families. Numerous children conceived through rape lack legal recognition, and the culture of impunity for sexual crimes still persists. Member States must act decisively to address this issue. Adopting a survivor-centric and rights-based approach to judicial remedies and repatriation efforts is the only way to deliver justice to the survivors. And in this regard, I welcome the launch of the Global Survivors Fund, which will provide much-needed reparations and redress mechanisms to victims of sexual violence worldwide. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ISIL has destroyed entire communities, uprooted families, and brainwashed thousands by spreading its toxic and misguided ideology. Today, the international community has an opportunity to prosecute the perpetrators, rehabilitate the victims, and facilitate reconstruction and community development in places destroyed by ISIL violence. The repatriation of women and children will accelerate that process, and the prosecution of ISIL fighters and their affiliates in accordance with international human rights law will help bring closure to victims. This is one of the defining counterterrorism challenges of our time. Inaction now will only make our future counterterrorism efforts harder. In this regard, rest assured that CTED will continue to do its utmost to support the global counterterrorism community in facing these challenges. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.